My talk is Listen to Your Heart, Infant and Parent Regulation. A big thank you to Dr. Miller and her lab for making this all possible. Here are the disclaimers. So a prominent focus of the year has been using Bronfenbrenner's model as a framework for understanding child development within the context of the child's meso, exo, macro, and chronosystems. All of these systems are critical for development, but the family is most influential for infants who are learning arousal regulation while interacting primarily with caregivers. As infant regulation also impacts caregiver functioning, it's important to study these dynamic interactions. Infant arousal is particularly important as it includes control of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological systems. One way to measure arousal regulation is through cardiac vagal activity during breathing, which is called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, or RSA. Essentially, detecting something that you need to engage with, fight, or flee from activates or suppresses your vagal nerve to help you respond appropriately. You can measure vagal nerve activity as the variability of the duration between heartbeats, which is how we define RSA. RSA reactivity is the difference between RSA at rest and RSA during an activity, and it reflects the efficiency and appropriateness of someone's response. Thus, it's a measure of attentional, emotional, and behavioral regulation and coping. Porges's polyvagal theory says that when faced with a stressor, RSA should be suppressed or decreased, allowing energy to be sent to engage the fight or flight mode. Because RSA suppression is RSA at baseline minus RSA during an activity, stress should result in a high suppression score. In contrast, positively engaging tasks should result in an increase in RSA, allowing for a soothing state that promotes social communication. This will be indicated by a negative suppression score. Research has shown that RSA reactivity impacts social, behavioral, and emotional functioning, and dysregulation relates to myriad negative mental health outcomes, including aggression, inattention, and emotion lability. We also know there are interactions between RSA reactivity and environmental responses. For example, among children with low RSA suppression, if they were exposed to high levels of marital conflict, the child would show more externalizing problems. And if they were exposed to low marital conflict, they would show lower levels of externalizing problems. Thus, RSA suppression, a measure of reactivity, is important for emotional and behavioral development. Additionally, differences have been found in RSA regulation when comparing neurotypical children and children with ASD or ADHD, although the patterns of these differences is still under investigation. While there is a fairly well-developed theory for RSA reactivity in children through adults, and dysregulation has been found among children with NDDs, less is known about the development of RSA reactivity in infants who are undergoing rapid changes in self-regulation, particularly in infants with high likelihood of NDDs. Scheinkopf conducted one longitudinal study comparing baseline RSA among infants who later developed ASD and neurotypical controls that found differences in developmental trajectories. However, further research is needed on RSA reactivity and in samples that compare different NDDs in order to better understand if reactivity differences precede NDDs or if they're outcomes of them, as well as to illuminate specificity of differences. Further, going back to Bronfenbrenner's model, more research is needed on arousal regulation development within the context of the family system. The ultimate plan is to test this model, where we expect concurrent and longitudinal associations among parenting stress with infant RSA suppression during a parent-child play task. However, as data collection and processing are still in progress, today I'll be talking about preliminary analyses, which included the following hypotheses: that there would be a significant positive correlation between parenting stress and RSA suppression from baseline to a parent-child play synchrony task, and exploratory analyses were conducted to visually inspect differences in correlations by recruitment group. The data come from a larger study that follows 125 infants from 12 to 36 months to identify shared and distinct early markers of ASD and ADHD. The sample is typically called a high-risk sample as children are recruited based on family history of neurodevelopmental disorders. However, in the spirit of all that we've learned about neurodiversity, I'm describing these infants as being at high likelihood for ADHD, ASD, or neurotypical development. For the current study, the 36 infants with RSA data at 12 or 18 months were included. Infants attended lab visits with a caregiver for behavioral testing, and standardized parent reports were filled out by the primary caregiver. Regarding measures, a single-channel ECG device was put on the baby to record RSA during a baseline child-friendly television show, as well as during a parent-child place synchrony task. Data were processed using mindware software by coders trained to reliability. Parenting stress for the primary caregiver was measured using the Parenting Stress Index, or PSI. Item examples are presented here. The measure includes a total stress score, parental distress score, parent-child dysfunctional interaction score, and a difficult child score. Most infants were 12 months old, with a fairly even split among recruitment groups, and about 55.6% of children were male. Most infants were white, 22.2% identified as Hispanic. Most caregivers had a college education or higher, and all but one caregiver was married. This is a correlation table that shows correlations controlling for recruitment group. And as you can see here, the parental distress subscale and total parenting stress were significantly correlated with infant RSA suppression. Additionally, the difficult child subscale was trending towards significance at p equals 0.05. Although we didn't statistically compare strengths of correlations between groups, these data suggest it will be worth exploring group differences with a larger sample size, as there may be moderation by recruitment group or diagnostic outcome. Our first hypotheses were supported, suggesting that parents with higher stress levels have children who are more aroused during a joint activity. This is consistent with previous literature in older children, which showed that children showed higher suppression in a joint activity task when their mothers were more controlling or critical. Thus, patterns of overarousal may be evident early in infancy. While we were not able to test the direction of effects yet, based on Bronfenbrenner's model, we expect that infant RSA regulation and parenting stress have a bidirectional relation. Infants of parents with high stress levels may have overactive fight or flight modes, which may inhibit their social engagement with their parents. And these factors may contribute to chronic stress for the infant and the parent. Further analyses broken down by age group and diagnostic outcome is needed, as prior research suggested developmental and diagnostic effects impact RSA development. As I mentioned, our future directions are to test longitudinal models of the transactional relation among infant RSA suppression with parenting stress, consistent with the Bronfenbrenner model, and to test for differences by diagnostic outcome. And while we don't have this data, I think it's important to include observations of parents, as context of the behavior has been shown to be important when studying RSA regulation. And additionally, measures of parent RSA may help us understand the role of heritability. Regarding intervention implications, intervention should take physiological measurements to track multi-level treatment change. And clinically, the findings from this study, once completed, may have implications for early intervention related to helping parents with elevated stress modulate their own arousal and their infant's arousal, particularly as arousal regulation may serve as a buffer from stressors as those children develop. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Miller and her lab for allowing me to do this research and for making it possible, and thanks to the collaborators. Thanks to my supervisors, Dr. Enriquez and Blacker, and everyone else who has helped me throughout the year.